Well, welcome everyone on this lovely Tuesday. Welcome to the Tuesday Lunch and Learn, the Aspetuck Land Trust Tuesday Lunch and Learn. Today we're joined by Dr. Charlotte Pyle for our amazing presentation about the otherworldly magic of tree communication. So beyond competition, trees communicate and cooperate to make healthy forests. Before we get started, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Jean Stets-Pachelski, and I'll be moderating today's Lunch and Learn, and wanted to talk to us just a quick minute about Zoom, the visual communication platform we're using. You'll note that at the bottom of your screen, for those familiar, you'll notice there are a number of tools. Today, we are going to be using the chat and the Q&A features. We will not be using the hand feature today. So we will be taking all questions at the end. Charlotte will be answering questions right after the presentation. So please do continue to put questions in the Q&A and also the chat box, and we will begin, throughout the presentation, we'll begin taking questions at the end of the presentation. So want to introduce Mary Ellen LeMay, who is the Aspetuck Land Trust Land Engagement Director here, and I'm going to pass it over to you, Mel, to get started with the presentation today.
All right, great. Thank you, Jean. I am really excited to have our guest speaker here today, and I'm very thankful for the help of Jean Stets-Pachelski. She has always been a wonderful Zoom moderator for us, and her skills have been acquired over through her business as a corporate coach for individual differences, and she's volunteering her time with us today to help manage this. So I'm very thankful to Jean, and I would like to introduce you to our speaker today, Charlotte Pyle, who I have known for probably 5 years now. Chairs the Connecticut Invasive Plant Working Group, Native Plant Alternatives Subcommittee, and I actually know her through that and the Connecticut Native Plant Working Group, and we've worked together on that. Charlotte has been a nature writer and writes quarterly for the Eastern Connecticut Forest Landowners Association. But what is so interesting also about Charlotte is her background, that prior coming to Connecticut, she worked for the Tahoe National Forest in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, and the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, and the Gifford Pinto National Forest in Washington, where she was awarded a PhD in forest ecosystem analysis with a focus on landscape ecology at the University of Washington. Here in Connecticut, she worked at the University of Connecticut as a forest ecologist and for the USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service. And so Charlotte's talk for us today is so interesting. It's definitely a topic that seems to be emerging over the last couple of years about the communication of trees and what goes on between them and the earth around them. And I was just fascinated to know that Charlotte did this lecture. And as for the Aspetuck Land Trust members, you know that our initiative for the Green Corridor is to get people to plant native plants, rethink their lawns, and avoid pesticides. And a big part of the native planting is our trees. Our native trees are extremely valuable. And many of you were probably on our Doug Tallamy talk about oaks, which was at the end of March. And this lecture that Charlotte is going to do today just seems like a perfect next step for us to learn not only about the tree's value to us, but to each other. And maybe we'll think about trees a little bit differently after we hear from Charlotte. So I would like to open the lecture to Charlotte. We can begin sharing her slides. And without further ado, here is Dr. Charlotte Pyle.
All right, thanks, Mel, and thanks, Jean, too. Today, I'll be talking about trees and their amazing interactions with each other and the other organisms that are found in the forest. But first, I want to cover a few basic things. Next slide. I need the next slide. There it is. There are some scientists who believe that people today have become plant blind. That is to say, the average person sees plants as some sort of inanimate background scenery, or people see plants as objects rather than something that is alive. Well, I'm here to tell you that although plants can't walk or talk like us, they are indeed living beings. Next slide. So let me digress a moment and ask you, as living beings, what do people need to survive? Next slide. Yes, food, water, shelter, and in the long run, if generations of humans are to survive through time, then people can't live without the opportunity to interact with unrelated members of the opposite sex. Next slide. And beyond the basics of reproduction, there is a need for other people, for companionship, for doing things that take more than one person, like physical tasks, refining new ideas with give and take, and sharing discoveries. Next slide. Now, what about trees? How do they get food? Next slide. This will be the first of my fairly technical slides, talking about how trees get food. They get their basic energy from the sun, and the process is called photosynthesis, where the chlorophyll in leaves is able to process sunlight plus carbon dioxide from the air and water to produce sugars. And the water can come from the roots, or it can come from fog drip on leaves. The photosynthesis process also puts oxygen out to the air, and that's why plants make you feel so good when you're out in the woods or even in your own house. And during photosynthesis, water vapor is released. Trees then use the sugars from photosynthesis as an energy source and a building block to make the tissues they need to grow and to make seeds. Making plant tissue also involves adding nutrients to the building blocks, and those nutrients come from the soil via the tree's roots. Now, this slide explains the chemistry of how trees get food, but it doesn't get into the importance of the relationships among trees and other organisms. Next slide. So let's think about shelter. Seedlings need protection from drying out too much. They need shelter from wind and sun, though ultimately a lot of new seedlings will need a lot of sun to grow. Being in the forest also protects seedlings from temperature extremes. Have you ever noticed how cool it is when you walk into the forest on a really hot day? And in this slide, did you notice that there isn't much growing in the forest understory? Next slide. Trees also need protection from being eaten. This fawn hiding in the weeds there is still nursing, and its mother is very, very hungry. One way seedlings and small trees can get shelter from large herbivores is in messy tangles of dead branches left on the forest floor. Next slide. This is I posing for a silly picture in an old-growth Douglas fir forest in Washington. As Mel said, I have a background in forestry, and that began with a traditional forestry education in the 1980s. Then in the 1990s, I studied forest ecosystems. There's a world of difference between the 1980s forest management versus seeing trees as part of a forest ecosystem around you. Next slide. Traditionally, forestry is about growing trees so that people will have the standing timber resources they need, so they can then cut down the trees and turn them into wood products, ranging from matchsticks to railroad ties, 2x4s to dimensional, not to mention pulp and paper products. The goal of timber production tends to make you look at the forest as a timber crop, kind of like a row crop. but just taking a little longer to mature. When people view the forest land as cropland, they look at the trees in terms of financial maturity. And the relevant question becomes, will we lose money in the long run if we don't cut this year? So the math for that equation is based on the fact that after trees come to a certain rate of growth, they aren't putting on as much new wood on the merchantable part of the year, merchantable part of the tree, as they did in the previous year. This way of thinking doesn't consider the value of large, old, slow-growing trees for wildlife or for the forest ecosystem as a whole. Next slide. A few minutes ago, we talked about how trees need light to photosynthesize and make the sugars they need to fuel their growth. At the same time, it is a fact that some trees get squeezed out by their neighbors, and ultimately trees that don't get the light they need will die. So it's natural for a young forest to begin with many, many tiny seedlings and end with a mature forest that has much, much smaller number of larger trees. And that has led to the traditional view of forests as a group of trees engaged with each other in a competition to the death for light, water, and nutrients. Next slide. Competition is real, but there is much more than competition going on in a forest ecosystem. And that's what I'll really be talking about today. Mycorrhizal relationships, where trees are connected by beneficial fungi underground. The many ways in which trees signal each other. And the way that trees are just one part of forest ecosystems. Ecosystems involve all the interactions that go on among plants, animals, and the non-living environment. Next slide. There are a lot of different kinds of fungi in the world, including mushrooms, yeasts, and molds. You've probably seen mushrooms like these in the forest. One interesting thing about mushrooms is that what you think of as a mushroom is only a small part of what the fungus really is. The mushrooms are the fungal fruiting bodies. They release spores that will spread and make new individuals, sort of like seeds from a pine tree. But hidden in sight from underground, actually, I didn't quite pull that off right. Hidden underground, the fungus can have a large system of root-like structures. Taken together, those structures are called the mycelium. The mass of mycelium of multiple fungal individuals is called the mycelia. Next slide. Now, fungi are neither plant nor animal. They don't photosynthesize like plants, but some of them have developed a kind of partnership with plants. When the word mycorrhiza was coined in 1885, it referred to the mutually beneficial partnership between a plant and certain types of below-ground fungi. Sometimes people today also use the word mycorrhiza as though it were a thing, a fungal organ that surrounds and interacts with the plant roots. Or they use mycorrhizae to mean the mycelium networks running through the soil. Foresters have focused on the help trees get from fungi. In contrast, mycologists study what the fungus gets from plants and how it does it. For forestry, the most well-studied relationship is the fact that the fungus helps the tree roots be more efficient in taking up water and nutrients from the soil. And this can make the difference between survival versus death on some sites. As traditional foresters see it, the relationship is nothing more than a tree paying for help in taking up water and nutrients by giving the fungus some of the sugars derived from the tree's photosynthesis. Looking at this photo, it's where the underground part of an Amanita fungus is attached to a tree's tiny, tiny root tips. This is taken with a microscope. Next slide. In the middle 1800s, scientists noticed that some fungi grew in association with plant roots. Writing around 1882, a Polish botanist named Franciszek Kamiński recognized and described how the relationship was mutually beneficial in the case of the plant pine sap. The details of the relationship between pine sap and the mycorrhizal fungi are different than for most plants because pine sap cannot photosynthesize. So in this case, the fungus shares some of the sugars it has gotten from nearby trees, as well as helping the pine sap take up nutrients and water from the soil. And then, rather than getting sugars from the pine sap plant, the fungus gets physical support. Now, as you may know, Europeans are into foraging for mushrooms, and a German named Albert Frank, who studied both plants and mushrooms, was commissioned by the King of Prussia to figure out a practical way to cultivate truffles. Truffles are choice edible fungi that grow in association with trees in forests. You also can get them at the candy store, but that's different. Some people find these truffles with the aid of female pigs who can sniff them out. Now, Albert Frank didn't succeed with cultivating truffles, but he did learn a lot about the relationship between truffle fungus and the plant roots. And he gave that relationship the name mycorrhiza, myco plus rhiza, fungus root, in a scientific article published in 1885. Myco and rhiza come from Greek words, but scientists Latinize scientific names and language. So in that world, the plural of mycorrhiza is mycorrhizae. But people also anglicize it and say the plural is mycorrhizas. Next slide. So we've talked about the big picture with mycorrhizal fungi. Now let's get to the details. This slide is an electron microscope photo from a talk by Suzanne Simard, who did some pioneering work on how trees share resources via mycorrhizal relationships. In this slide, the two finger-like projections are tiny, tiny tree rootlets, greatly magnified. Each thread-like thing is a hypha growing from a fungus that has a mycorrhizal relationship with the tree rootlets. The word hyphae, incidentally, is the plural of hypha. A hypha is a tiny, tiny filament of fungus not visible to the naked eye. The average size of a mycorrhizal fungus hypha is on the order of 5 microns, maybe up to 10 microns wide. And there are 1,000 microns in a single millimeter and 25 millimeters in an inch. So you can tell the electron microscope is an absolutely wonderful machine. It gives us these photos. Being connected to the fungal mycelium with all of its fine filaments of hyphae enables the plant root to have an incredibly much more access to molecules of water and waterborne nutrients and other compounds in the soil. The hyphae get in between the tiniest of soil particles and get access to nutrients that the much wider plant roots just can't reach. Next slide. This picture of fungal mycelium was taken with the close-up lens of a regular camera. As I said, you can't see individual hypha. You need an electron microscope for that. So what looks like single strands of hyphae actually are many, many, many strands spun together, like yarn, into a mycelial cord. Each hypha is so unimaginably small that in a deciduous forest, a teaspoon of soil can hold several hundred yards of hyphae. And in a coniferous forest dominated by ectomycorrhizal fungi, the length of hyphae in a teaspoon of soil is measured in miles, literally. So there's a lot more going on underground with fungi than is obvious. Next slide. Foresters didn't even used to consider mycorrhizae. And it really didn't matter because things were going on just fine. And they didn't know there could be a problem. Kind of like that moment just before the train wreck. For foresters, there was what amounted to a disastrous train wreck when they tried to revegetate strip mines in Pennsylvania, and all the trees they planted kept dying. Next slide. It turned out that the soil had become too disturbed. It lacked topsoil, and there were no plants left to support mycorrhizal fungi. Then people discovered if they inoculated the roots with mycorrhizal fungi, the trees they planted then grew way better because the fungal mycelia helped the trees take up water and nutrients. And in some cases, the fungus even blocked the uptake of heavy metals into the tree roots. Next slide. This Amanita mushroom is an example of a mycorrhizal species that is found on many types of trees all over the temperate and boreal regions of the Northern Hemisphere. And by the time Suzanne Simard started working with mycorrhizal fungi in the early 1990s, foresters were all well aware of the importance of mycorrhizal relationships. What Dr. Simard did that was new was to measure how much and when sugars moved from one tree into another in real-life situations. She developed a way to bring some sophisticated equipment from the laboratory out into the real world to measure radioactive isotopes of carbon, so she could figure out exactly which trees the sugars were coming from and which trees they were going to. Using radioactive isotopes of carbon, Simard found that paper birch trees that were overshadowing young Douglas fir sent carbon-containing sugars to the fir via the mycorrhizae. What was even more amazing was that when paper birch was dormant in the winter, the evergreen Douglas fir sent photosynthates back to the birches. These exchanges help both species survive, and that helps keep the forest ecosystem as a forest. Next slide. Dr. Simard's work was published in 1997 in the prestigious scientific magazine Nature. Her study was featured on the cover with the words Wood Wide Web. The important thing about Suzanne Simard's results is that they opened up a whole new way of thinking about mycorrhizal relationships in the forest. Her results went way beyond the idea that an individual tree formed a mycorrhizal relationship with a fungus only to benefit its individual self. And the idea of cooperation for the common good rather than competition for dominance was threatening to many people. Dr. Simard's work was attacked at science meetings with allegations of flawed methods. The fictional character, Patricia Westerford, in Richard Powers' book, The Overstory, is thought to be loosely based on Suzanne Simard's work, with a little bit of Peter Wohlleben, author of The Hidden Life of Trees, thrown into the mix. Over the years, Dr. Simard continued her work on more and more aspects of how trees interact via mycorrhizae. She and her group at the University of British Columbia and researchers all over the world are finding more and more ways that trees communicate. Next slide. Yes, trees communicate with each other and with other organisms. But before I get into that, what do you think one tree might like to tell another tree? Next slide. Danger. Trees send out warnings via mycorrhizae to other trees about insect attacks. Sometimes those are general distress signals that other trees will respond to by putting energy into making their leaves nasty to eat. Where there is an area of unpalatable vegetation, the leaf-eating insects will go somewhere else. And incidentally, I wondered if this was a reason for certain hemlock forests in Connecticut appearing to be more resistant to hemlock woolly adelgids. Altogether, there is an advantage both to putting energy into sending out and into responding to distress signals. Next slide. Mycorrhizal fungi have been shown to carry signals that plants are being stressed by disease. In British Columbia, Suzanne Simard found that when Douglas fir sent out a signal, other trees, including birches, responded by increasing their defense enzymes. And then The mycorrhizal fungi carried some of those enzymes back to help the Douglas fir. Next slide. Another kind of signaling that trees do is to send out airborne signals, volatile chemicals that come out of the tree and evaporate at normal temperatures. Then the chemicals are spread by the wind. Plants release ethylene gas as a generic danger signal. To attract insect predators, plants send out the same pheromones that insects send into the air to communicate with their relatives, which also helps the predators locate them. But there's an issue with sending an airborne signal. The prevailing winds may not carry it in all directions, and the signals may dissipate rapidly. Next slide. This cherry leaf was chewed by a sawfly larva. I know this because my husband, who is a backyard bugologist, among other talents, told me so. Now the tree might know it also. The way the tree can know what's attacking it is it recognizes the saliva of different insects. And that ability is important because then the tree doesn't just send out a generic distress signal telling its neighbors to put energy into making their leaves nasty to eat. When the tree knows what is attacking it, it can send out a call to the predatory insects that will control the leaf eaters. Next slide. This green caterpillar is a tomato hornworm larva. Sometimes the control insect that is called in by the tree is a parasitoid insect, like these wasps that lay eggs in the tomato hornworm larvae. The wasps hatch, the wasp larvae develop unseen inside the body of the hornworm. When the wasp larvae get ready to pupate, they build their white cocoons on the back of the hornworm caterpillar. Next slide. Mycorrhizal fungi do things to promote tree health. Remember, promoting tree health is in their own best interest because the plants are the basic source of the food for the fungi. White pine can have an amazing partnership with mycorrhizal fungus called Laccaria bicolor. The fungus is attractive to hungry springtails, so they come to it. But when these little soil-dwelling organisms start eating the fungus, they get poisoned. The fungus then digests their bodies and transfers an astonishing amount of nitrogen into the white pine. In an experiment, scientists found up to 25% of the nitrogen in white pine tissues came from springtails. Next slide. It turns out that mycorrhiza also can carry electrical signals. One time I was working on a computer at UConn and both it and the lights went out. Right after that, there was a huge boom as a transformer blew. In that case, the electricity was traveling faster than the speed of sound. Next slide. Now, there have been some studies on the movement of electrical impulses within plants and within the soil. Compared to the speed of electricity in a wire, these impulses go very, very slowly. For example, in a lima bean leaf, they move on the order of 1 centimeter per minute. It's not clear to me the degree to which electrical impulses that move in the soil are carried by mycorrhizal fungi, as opposed to being carried by water in the soil. But the point is that electrical impulses are another way that plants send signals within their own bodies and beyond. And this is something that can go in all directions, unlike windborne volatiles. Next slide. The thing about using electrical signals that gets philosophers really excited is that the sending of information with electrical signals is how animal brains work. Now, humans are already having to realize that some of the distinctions we have made to divide humans from lower animals, like the act of using tools, don't really hold. And certainly, the idea that trees are anything like animals must be silly, isn't it? Next slide. Monica Gagliano is a scientist working at the University of Sydney in Australia. She has done groundbreaking work in studying how plants communicate. She publishes in peer-reviewed science journals. She also works with shamans to learn how to hear what plants are saying. Dr. Gagliano has shown that plants respond to sound and also make sounds, most of them outside of the range of human hearing. She has also published scientific papers about how plants can learn and remember things. Her scientific work is getting people talking about what the ethical responsibilities of human interactions with plants should be. If plants are beings having consciousness and their own perspectives and voices, as opposed to being just a lower life form. Monica Gagliano also has done some experiments looking at when seeds will germinate. She concluded that seeds recognize when they're in the presence of friendly neighbors. The idea that plant seeds can make a choice about when to germinate based on sensing something about their current neighbors has bearing on the idea that plants can become grouped into communities via processes other than competitive interactions. Next slide. There was a PhD student of Suzanne Simard's named Kevin Byler, and he mapped fungal connections among Douglas fir trees and 2 species of mycorrhizal fungi in a small area. In this graphic, the bigger the circle, the bigger the tree. Big old trees possess bigger root systems, and they associate with more extensive mycorrhizal networks. And of course, they have more root tips, so it makes sense that they would have more connection to all the other trees around them. Dr. Simard began calling these highly linked trees hub trees. Next slide. Simard now calls the hub trees mother trees. She leads a group of researchers to study trees in the Mother Tree Project. The group has learned some interesting things. Mother trees appear to recognize their own relatives, and they send out more carbon, those sugars, and defense compounds to their own close relatives. This can help young trees growing in too much shade to survive until there's an opening in the overstory. When injured, mother trees send out resources to their relatives as sort of a legacy. Because mother trees are connected to so many other trees, they will be more well-informed about what signals are being passed from tree to tree within the mycorrhizae. Remember that when trees are stressed, they do send out signals. The many connections going out from mother trees can then stimulate a larger number of trees to prepare for insects or disease. And what this all comes down to is removing a mother tree results in weakening of the connections and the loss of a source of both nutrients and messaging. And the overall forest growth can suffer for it. Next slide. Things have come a long way since Suzanne Simard faced relentless criticism for her outlandish work. Her work now has been successfully replicated by others, and there are many more people working on associated topics. Now, the idea that trees can talk, communicate via mycorrhizae and other means is not considered so outlandish. And perhaps people will soon be ready to learn how to apply new understandings of how forest ecosystems work when they make decisions about how to do large-scale forestry. Knowing about how mycorrhizal networks operate makes it obvious that cutting down the biggest trees in a stand will not be a healthy thing for the ecosystem. And removing all the competing vegetation from a logged site will be taking food from the mycorrhizal fungi that remain in the soil. Next slide. In yesterday's world, using words like talk or communicate or language in relationship to plants was considered anthropomorphizing. That means attributing strictly human traits to non-human beings. Verboten, very unprofessional. And yet, learning to understand what trees have to say should have bearing on how forest managers interact with forests. Monica Gagliano talks about getting away from the idea that language means words spoken and understood by people. In a broad sense, language is a system of meaningful signs. It is much more than just the words that can be heard by people. Language can be visual, audible, or something else, like vibrations or scents. As non-plant beings, we need to try to listen to what plants are saying in their own mode of expression. As Paul Stamets said in the movie Fantastic Fungi, which I highly recommend, the fact that we lack language skills to communicate with nature does not impugn the concept that nature is intelligent. It speaks to our inadequacy for communication. Next slide. John Muir wrote in his journal in 1869, "When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find that it is bound fast by 1,000 invisible cords that cannot be broken to everything in the universe." He simplified this sentence when he included it in the book, My First Summer in the Sierra, but I like this version better. It calls to mind the unseen mycorrhizal networks that underlie the trees we can see. Did you know that more than half the biomass in a forest ecosystem lives below the ground? Like earthworms, springtails, creatures too small to see with the naked eye, in addition to the plant roots, mycorrhizal fungi, and other types of fungi and bacteria. Two ideas are pretty ingrained into our Western culture. The idea that people should strive for self-sufficiency. The idea that survival of the fittest totally explains how the world is organized. Also ingrained is the idea that people are something special, so we're not part of the natural world. It's no wonder that people were threatened by the prominence of cooperation rather than competition in Suzanne Simard's work in 1997. Even now, it's hard to wrap the mind around the idea that for forest ecosystems to hold together, it will be necessary to do things to promote, not block, avenues of communication and cooperation among trees and the underground fungi in the forest. Those things must include understanding and acting on what roles we as humans can take if we let go of the guiding principle of domination. Next slide. So, thanks for listening.
Fantastic, Darla. Thank you so much. We do have a few questions.
Okay.
So let's dig in. Okay. So, yep, we do have a number of questions about whether this will be recorded, and yes, in fact it is. And let's see what we have. So, do plant cells have resting membrane potentials? And how are electrical signals transmitted within plants, Charlotte?
As far as I know, it's a chemical thing, but it's getting beyond my understanding of the plant physiology.
Okay. And how does one recognize mother trees?
Partly by their size. So just by virtue of being bigger, they're the ones with more roots, and with more roots, they have more connections to mycorrhizae. And I've sort of made it sound like, you know, there's a tree and one fungus connection, but in fact, many different species and many individuals of those species will get connected up to different roots of the tree. So the bigger the tree, the more roots there are, and that means the more connections. And the fungi move underground to other trees. So that's bringing a connection between the big tree to another tree, the more fungi it has, the more connections it has. So that's kind of how you recognize them. But the study that was so cool, done by Pyle, they actually looked at what's the movement between one tree and another and found many more connections between the big trees than the little ones.
So thank you, Charlotte. So we have another question. What about the big vines in Connecticut forests that attack trees? Would this be considered danger? And trees communicate, would this be a danger that a tree would communicate about? And should people intervene with vine growth in forests?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know the degree to which a tree recognizes that it's being, the vines are basically shading the tree out. And then if they wrap tightly around a small tree, they're actually choking it, choking the movement. But I don't know whether it would send out that generic danger signal or it would just kind of let that happen. Mm. It always in forest management, there's the question of why are you managing this forest? And obviously we have forests that are managed to grow timber products. That's our interest. In other situations, we're trying to manage the forest to promote wildlife habitat, or even to promote a place that we want to be for spiritual reasons. And, there's letting an old tree die, and if the vine kills a tree, that hasn't destroyed the forest. What it's left is a snag. It's left the opportunity for light to go down to the forest floor and other things to grow. It's left the opportunity for birds to perch in that tree. And at some point, that dead tree will fall to the ground and become a log that will provide habitat for creatures that live on the ground, chipmunks, that kind of thing, and also salamanders and insects that are going to break that log down and then recycle it into the soil. So the death of a tree is not a tragedy in the forest. But if you've got one tree in your yard and that's your tree, then that death is a tragedy and it's time to cut that vine down.
So that leads to the next question about invasive species in general. We hear a lot about some of the invasive species that are crowding out our forests. What would you say to people who are looking at things like Norway maples and different fast-growing, what we have classified as invasive trees in Connecticut? What would you say to them about managing that forest or that area?
The way a plant gets classified as invasive is the very first thing is it's non-native, but not every non-native plant becomes invasive. The rest of that definition is that plant causes trouble in natural areas. In Connecticut, we say in natural areas. At the federal level, people talk about trouble in agricultural areas or human health. But in Connecticut, the plant causes trouble in natural areas, and it has the capacity to spread from one place to the other and become dominant. And so that's by virtue of not being native, it doesn't have natural controls within the ecosystem so that the non-native plants can get out of control. And you've seen that. You've seen Barbary in the understory. The Norway maple is kind of interesting. It can reproduce in its own shade, whereas in our forests here in New England, there's sort of a relationship between beech and sugar maple, and they sort of rotate back and forth what can reproduce. But once a Norway maple is in the system, it can reproduce in its own shade, but its shade is too dense for the sugar maple to reproduce. So that becomes something that is undesirable in managing for natural ecosystems. From a forestry point of view, the wood of Norway maple is not really very high quality wood. And Norway maple is also interesting because it comes out earlier, it leaves out earlier, and it hangs on to its leaves later. So as it comes out earlier, it's casting shade where our spring ephemerals would come out. And by virtue of both coming out earlier and staying out later, it is getting more resources per year. Its photosynthesizing in a longer growing season than the sugar maple, which that's one way it outcompetes sugar maple by getting bigger. So overall, if you're looking at natural ecosystems, these invasive trees that have met that definition of invasive are not really what we want. The obviously in the question of management, you know, there's how much time do you have and what's your worst problem? I think tree of heaven is kind of a scary tree with its ability, when you cut it, it sprouts. So it's more difficult to get rid of. That's all.
Thank you, Charlotte. So there are other questions of other invasives. One specifically about, I'm clearing out a grove of invasive burning bush, understory to large trees. Will this communicate negatively?
I don't know. Certainly the, assuming, and there are more than one kind, there's different groups of mycorrhizal fungi. The, and I don't know whether the burning bush makes connections with the same kind of fungi as our hardwoods do. Birch and pines have the ectomycorrhizal fungi, and then some of the other hardwoods have different, I learned it as endomycorrhizal. There's another word for it now that's escaping me, but they have different, the fungus works differently in how it engages with the tree roots. And I have no idea what burning bush does. But assuming that it did have a connection, then it would send out a signal, and that might bring help from some of the other things it's attached to. There are some people that, you know, I come from a forestry background, so I'm looking at what are the trees doing. There are some people that look at this as the fungus is sort of manipulating everything else to make a system that it can grow well in. And in that case, the fungus might make a decision about, was this invasive plant helping or harming? And that's being studied, not in the sense of invasives, but in the sense of the degree to which the fungus can promote tree root growth in certain directions.
Thank you, Charlotte. So another question is about garlic mustard. I've heard that garlic mustard, an invasive plant, secretes a chemical that damages the fungi. Is anyone studying this? And what can we plant to squeeze out that garlic mustard?
There are studies on the allelopathy of garlic mustard, and it does put chemicals out in its roots. And the studies I'm aware of were done in regard to, is that preventing tree seedlings from germinating? And in laboratory studies, that was found to be the case. But when people tried to get those same results out in real forests, they weren't getting those results. And I expect that that's because the what's coming out of the garlic mustard got a little more dilute in the real forest. I wasn't aware of the garlic mustard harming the mycorrhizal fungi. And I think there was a second half to that question, but I lost track of it.
It was regarding planting. What do we plant to discourage or crowd out the garlic mustard? That might be an issue for another lecture.
Yeah, and I'm not convinced there is anything you can plant. I think the point is to remove the garlic mustard.
Right. Thank you. And one person was watching and noticed that the tomato caterpillar had the wasps on its back and is asking the question, well, what happened to the tomato caterpillar, the hornworm that we had seen? They're calling it a tomato caterpillar.
Well, those wasp larvae lived inside it and kind of ate its insides up. This is a horrible way to die. The parasitoid insects kill their host, as opposed to a parasite that takes from the host but doesn't kill it. So it's really a scary thing. But on the other hand, if you've ever had a garden with your tomatoes with those horrible tomato hornworm holes in them, then you perceive the hornworm, the wasp, as a beneficial insect.
Absolutely. And so another question, what is the cause of a giant mother tree uprooting or falling down that way?
Say it again.
Uh, Someone was making an observation about a giant mother tree uprooting or falling down, and what's the usual cause of one of these giant mother trees uprooting or falling down?
I'm sorry, I can't get, then there's this word I can't get.
Oh, the giant mother tree. So I think we're looking at these giant mother tree, and maybe the person who has posed the question can help clarify by putting that into the Q&A. But the question is asked is, what is the usual cause?
Oh, the usual cause. Okay, that was
Yes.
the word was coming.
Thanks, Charlotte.
Yeah. So trees get sick and die for different reasons. Also, big trees sticking out are more able to have wind hit them. We see this in hurricanes with the white pines. They like Douglas fir trees. They need a lot of light, so they're the ones that are shooting up to get tall and get in the light. That makes them more prone to wind damage. So a wind, like a hurricane, can take out those kind of trees. There can be a disease that isn't warded off, and then the roots die. Or, for some reason, just a whole defoliation episode occurs and the tree dies. And then when trees die, ultimately they come down to the ground. But they're sort of, are they uprooted like by wind, or did they fall to the ground because their roots failed? And when trees die, obviously the roots are no longer well connected.
So another question about our role. Should we aspire to keep baby trees grown by the mother tree, or should they be moved?
I think that kind of getting back to how forests work, spatially, there's a lot of little trees when a forest starts. And then over time, the trees get bigger, and they do have to outcompete each other. That competition is not, it's not absent from the forest. It just doesn't explain everything. So the mother tree will help trees, but at some point, some of those trees are going to get shaded out. And that is thinking about, should we move them, kind of looking at that in another way. There's been, particularly in the West, this idea that after you log, you should remove all the competing vegetation, like take out all the alder, which of course is fixing nitrogen, and it's a wonderful tree, but it does compete with the Douglas fir seedlings. So people would remove all the competing vegetation, so when they went and planted, then their trees would have a better chance of growing. But unbeknownst to them, they were also removing all those underground connections that would have helped the trees. So it's a slightly different situation than in our forests, where we may be looking at little trees that are being helped by the mother tree. But I think if we do nothing, there's sort of that natural way of, as trees get bigger, some trees are lost, and that would be natural to happen. I wouldn't dig up trees unless for some reason you needed a little seedling.
So another question regarding research on invasives. Has there been research on the underground impact between some of our current invasives, for instance, Japanese barberry or euonymus, which begin to cover the entire forest surface area?
There was some work done at Rutgers about, I think it was barberry changing the pH of the soil. And the last I heard, that work had not been able to be replicated. But there is that interest in the soil changes undergoing, being created by having the leaves of the invasive plant come to the ground and be recycled into the soil. And those leaves may have different chemical characteristics than the native vegetation.
So someone was making a comment about the Judi Dench documentary, My Passion for Trees. What do you think about this film, and encouraging people to see it?
I'm so sorry I haven't seen it. What does this person think about it?
They seem to love it. So something else to see, right? And another comment, really thanking you so much for this presentation and pointing to a recent cartoon for children about the competition between trees rather than cooperation. They said it was very interesting in light of what you presented and speaks to larger issues. And if you had to put a number on it, how cooperative would you say trees are in aiding each other rather, and I'm going to take a moment with this to be specific with this, aiding each other rather than not? For instance, the mother tree ignoring or stopping beneficial things going on to non-relatives. So that question is, if you had to put a number on it, how cooperative would you say trees are? Now that you put them in, not that you put them all in one category, but they're interested in knowing your view.
I don't think I could put a number on it, but what I've tried to say today is that cooperation is a part of how the forest works. It's not driven by this survival of the fittest. It's driven by the relationships among not just trees, but trees and animals and trees and mycorrhizal fungi. And, when you go back to Doug Tallamy, he's talking about the birds that feed their babies, the caterpillars, need the plants. And that's how ecosystems work. And people who plant non-native plants that don't support the caterpillars and whatnot that the birds eat, then are doing something that doesn't make the ecosystem work well. And to me, that's the important issue. And as I say, I can't put a number on it.
Thank you, Charlotte. And one question for you about communication. Are trees communicating danger about climate change?
I would assume they're feeling stressed about, as the climate changes, there's more water stress as things dry, or there's more, unexpected weather. And I don't know how to hear that communication, but I suspect it's going on.
And so when it comes to native trees, do native trees have a different level of integration with fungi than non-native trees?
I don't know. I imagine that they do. A lot of the fungi, though, are, distributed worldwide, or, say in the Northern Hemisphere. So that there is perhaps more of the same fungi are interacting with different trees in different ecosystems than you might think. And there really aren't, as far as I can understand, a situation where there's one plant species and it's only mycorrhizal fungi. There's multiple species.
And are trees planted as a specimen plant at risk from not being connected to other trees?
Yeah, I think so.
Great.
And you see that, and the tree looks like it ought to be doing fine, and it's not doing well. And it is perhaps because it doesn't have any connections. Or it also might be something that's going on, like they build a sidewalk all the way around it or something.
And we have about a dozen or so more questions for the people who are sitting in. And Charlotte, so we're just going to proceed here and just let everybody know that we will be here for just a little bit more. And Charlotte, would that be okay with you if we continue for 10 more questions or so?
Sure.
Okay, great. So another question, if I plant a new tree in the same place where a dead tree was removed, does it connect to the mycorrhizal system and the system continues as before? Or is there some new recognition by the other trees and that takes some time?
My understanding is that the fungus is out there looking for connections to be made. And obviously when there's a hole, then it's going to work on the connections, the other connections, but it would seem to me that it would also, as in its looking around, would find that new tree.
There's another question here. In forest gaps, are thickets of young trees communicating with each other while they are all growing to reach the canopy?
I don't know. If they are, they're probably expressing stress of, I need to grow fast. And you see that there's been a lot of studies in what they call gap dynamics, where you have a forest with, consistent forest cover, and then for some reason a tree comes down, and there's shade tolerant trees waiting in the understory, like sugar maples or hemlocks. And they will take, with the light that comes in, it's just a couple of years before the overstory closes in, the trees will try to shoot up. But in the meantime, they've had leaves on them that are better at being able to photosynthesize in the shade. And that's how they're surviving. I mean, they're maybe surviving with help from the mother tree, but they're also photosynthesizing with their shade leaves. And the ability of that tree to put on sun leaves and take advantage of the new light is one thing that's going to make one tree outcompete the other by it can respond more quickly to the sun. As to whether they're consulting with each other about who's doing what, I don't know, but I would think that at this point it sort of becomes ability to take advantage of that canopy gap, and then that sort of relates to competition at that point.
So some along the same lines, people are thinking about specific trees that may be better suited to be a companion tree or planting in an understory. Would it be helpful to think about that as we're planning for a homegrown park?
There's this concept of shade tolerance, and different trees are more tolerant of shade or intolerant of shade. And when you have a tree that's intolerant, it doesn't make sense to put it under a tree that's going to shade it. And the ultimate example of that is those Norway maples that make such dense shade. And pine trees, or white pines, are sort of intermediate in tolerance, but they also grow fast, so they can outcompete their competition. Something like pitch pine is very intolerant of shade, so it would never want to be under another tree.
So going back to your idea on communication and the thoughts you've presented here, there is one question about plant communication and plant language, and talk about plant consciousness. What do you think about this, and what should we understand about it?
I will say that Monica Gagliano's book is on my reading list. I haven't actually read the book. I've read some of the articles I've found on the internet and read what other people have said about her work. But I think it's important in just changing our attitude from this kind of arrogance that we are separate from nature, and that lower beings don't have consciousness. I think it's worth getting away from that.
Now, Charlotte, if you need a seedling, what is the best time to remove or replant it?
When it's
Pretty
dormant, I guess it's not well thought of to try to transplant things in the middle of the summer. People transplant when trees are dormant.
Another question, a number of things here, continue questions about burning bush. It says, in reforesting an empty space where I've removed the burning bush, should I plant mixed tree seedlings or two that work well together?
I think the thing is to consider what sort of site do you have, and how does the soil relate to the needs of the tree. And so if it's dry soil, you plant something that can tolerate dry soil, and that would be more than one species, and you might plant those. You might also realize that some things grow faster than the other. And again, if you have a tree that's intolerant of shade, then you don't want to plant it right next to something that's going to outcompete it by growing faster. But the bottom line is you want to match what you put on the tree, on the site. The tree should be able to tolerate what's on the site, because you don't want to be fooling around with having to add fertilizer or water it all the time.
And two other questions here. One about leaving leaves on the ground in wood areas. Is it all right to rake them out occasionally?
Well, the leaves are part of that ecosystem. They're being broken down by organisms, and then the nutrients are recycled back into the soil. There's, what you do around your house is partly driven by, what you want to have happen around your house. It isn't necessarily driven by what is the most natural thing to do. And if there's something in the leaves you don't like or you think they're ugly, then you can rake them, but it's certainly not helping the forest in any way to rake the leaves.
I guess two other questions here. One about how destructive is barberry to the Connecticut forest in relating to what we're talking about?
Barbary takes up a lot of space, and that means that there's less room for diversity of other species. And, we don't know everything about every species, but there's kind of a general guiding principle that having a diversity of species means you have a diversity of way things can work. And when you have an understory that's all barberry or barberry and multiflora rose, then you have two species. And that's not giving you so much diversity of the way things work. It's also not giving you the diversity of when you get pollen, for the associated insects that would want to be using those plants.
And we'll wrap our questions with this last one. Would a walnut connect with an oak or an oak with a maple by the mycorrhizal system?
I don't think so. I think the oaks are going with the ectomycorrhizae, and the walnut and the maple are going, the maple for sure is going with the other group of mycorrhizae that I can't think of the name of, that used to be the endomycorrhizae. They separated that group into more species. So the oaks and the birch and the pines kind of all are on the same system.
Well, thank you so much, Charlotte, for all of these wonderful answers to the questions. Thanks so much to the people who posed the question today. And with that, I'll pass it over to Mary Ellen LeMay.
Great. Thank you, Jean, for monitoring all the questions. Those were some of the smartest questions I think we've ever gotten. Brilliant, brilliant questions. And thank you for answering them so well, Charlotte. There actually was one more, and I'm kind of curious to the answer to this. So the cicadas are going to appear shortly. And, will they harm our trees, or are the trees preparing for them? Or are the trees used to having them show up every 7 or 14 or 21 years as they do? What about the cicadas?
I don't know. I do know that they're periodical cicadas, so they're not coming every year. So but if they're eating the trees, and I don't know that they are, but have to ask my bugologist husband what's going on there.
Yes, that would be great. So this has been very, very informative and interesting. We've gotten some wonderful comments from the chat saying it was a wonderful presentation, very understandable for the layperson. And it really was. And I was so thankful, and really interesting information, and appreciate your taking your time with us today. This has been recorded, and everyone who's registered, we will send a copy of the recording, because a couple of you have asked if you can hear it again. And we'll also put this on our website with our other lunch and learn, so you'll have a chance to hear it again. So it was excellent and timely, and I'm gonna have to watch that movie with Judi Dench because I love her. So maybe I'll watch it tonight. So
well, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and thank you, Jean, for fielding those questions and massaging the multiple questions into one understandable question. It's very helpful.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And have a great rest of the day. Enjoy this beautiful weather. And big thanks to Jean and Charlotte for doing this great program today. So have a great time, everybody. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.